There was a version of this country where buying a home was boring. Not an investment strategy, not a wealth-building vehicle, not a hedge against inflation, just a place to live that you eventually owned outright. You saved, you bought, you paid it off, you stayed. The house was not supposed to make you rich. It was supposed to make you stable. That stability was the foundation of everything else. The ability to raise children without fear of displacement, to absorb a job loss without losing your address, to retire without a rent payment consuming your fixed income. The home was the floor. And then the floor became a financial product. And financial products are not designed for stability. They are designed for yield. And once your floor became someone else's yield, everything built on top of it became fragile. Homeownership rates in the United States peaked in 2004 at just over 69%. By the mid-2020s, that number had declined, and among adults under 45, the decline was sharp enough to represent a generational rupture, not a temporary dip, but a structural shift in who gets to own and who is permanently rented to. That shift did not happen because young people stopped wanting homes. It happened because the housing market was reorganized around a different buyer. Not the family saving for a down payment. Not the first-time buyer trying to time the market. The institutional buyer. The fund. The entity for whom a house is not a home, but a unit of yield-generating real estate, priced not by what a working household can afford, but by what the asset class will bear. Understanding how we got here requires going back to a crash. In 2008, the American housing market collapsed. Home values dropped dramatically across the country. Foreclosures spiked. Millions of households lost homes they had spent years building equity in. The wreckage was enormous. But wreckage, from a certain angle, looks like opportunity. As home prices bottomed out between 2010 and 2013, large institutional investors began purchasing distressed properties at scale. Not one house here and there, tens of thousands of single-family homes, systematically acquired across the most economically distressed markets, converted into rental units, and assembled into portfolios that could be managed, securitized, and traded like any other financial asset. This was new. Single-family home rentals had always existed, but they were historically the domain of small individual landlords, a person who owned one or two properties in their local area. What happened after 2010 was the institutionalization of that market. The replacement of the small local landlord with a corporate entity managing thousands of units through centralized systems, driven by return targets set by distant capital allocators. The homes did not change. The ownership structure did. And that change had consequences that are still unfolding. The first consequence was supply compression. When institutional buyers entered local markets at scale, they competed directly with first-time home buyers for the same inventory, the affordable starter home, the modestly priced house in a working neighborhood. But they were not competing on equal terms. A fund with access to large amounts of capital can make all-cash offers, close quickly, waive contingencies, and absorb losses on individual units that would be catastrophic for an individual buyer. The first-time buyer, dependent on mortgage approval, constrained by income verification, and carrying the anxiety of the largest purchase of their life, cannot compete with that. The fund wins the house. The buyer loses the house. The buyer goes back to renting. And increasingly, the person they rent from is the same fund that outbid them. That is not a market functioning normally. That is a market that was restructured to produce a specific outcome. The second consequence was rent extraction. Once institutional ownership of single-family rentals reached critical mass in certain markets, the competitive pressure on rents shifted. In a healthy rental market with diverse ownership, rent is constrained by competition between landlords and by the income levels of local tenants. When ownership consolidates, that constraint weakens. A landlord who owns one rental property in a neighborhood has strong incentives to keep a reliable tenant happy. A fund that owns a significant percentage of rental inventory in a market has different incentives entirely. Its obligation is not to the tenant. Its obligation is to the return target. And if the return target requires a rent increase, the tenant receives the rent increase, not because costs went up. Because the ownership structure changed, there is also a pricing coordination problem that requires no conspiracy to explain. When multiple large institutional owners are using algorithmic pricing software that monitors market-wide rental data and adjusts prices based on competitor behavior, rents across an entire market can rise in lockstep without any explicit agreement between owners. The algorithm observes. The algorithm adjusts. Every landlord using the same system adjusts similarly. Rents rise. This has been documented and is currently the subject of legal scrutiny in several jurisdictions. But documentation and legal process are slow. The rent increases are immediate. The third consequence was the wealth transfer. Homeownership was, for most of the 20th century, the primary mechanism through which middle-income households built wealth. Not through stock portfolios, not through business ownership, Through equity accumulation in a home purchased at an accessible price, paid down over decades, and eventually owned outright. That mechanism required one thing above all else, that home prices remain within reach of working households. When home prices are driven by investor demand and institutional capital, in addition to end-user demand, they rise faster than the incomes of the people who would otherwise buy them. The equity that a working household would have accumulated by purchasing in 2015 or 2018 instead accumulates inside a portfolio. The household that was priced out does not build equity. It pays rent. The rent builds equity for the fund. The wealth that used to transfer to the household now transfers to the investor. That is a structural wealth transfer operating continuously, silently, and legally. It does not require malice. It requires only that the rules of the market favor capital over income, and the rules do. The fourth consequence is the feedback loop. Rising home prices in markets with constrained supply and heavy investor presence do not solve themselves. They compound. Households that cannot afford to buy continue renting. Continued rental demand supports rent increases. Rent increases reduce the ability to save for a down payment. Reduced savings extend the rental period. Extended rental periods generate more yield for institutional owners. More yield attracts more institutional capital. More institutional capital purchases, more inventory. More inventory purchases tighten supply for buyers. Tighter supply raises prices further. The loop closes, and inside that loop, the working household runs in place while the asset beneath them appreciates in someone else's name. There is a version of this story that is told as a personal failure. You did not save enough. You waited too long. You chose the wrong city. You spent too much on other things. You should have bought when prices were lower, as though the people who were priced out in 2015 were simply not trying hard enough in 2010. That version of the story is convenient for everyone who benefits from the current structure. It relocates a systemic problem inside the individual. It converts a market design failure into a personal responsibility failure. It asks the person who is outbid by a fund with institutional capital to examine their spending habits. The actual story is simpler and less comfortable. The housing market was accessible to working households when it was primarily a market for end users, people who wanted to live in the homes they bought. It became less accessible as it became a market for investors, entities that want to profit from the homes they hold. Those two sets of motivations are not compatible. An end-user market prices homes by what buyers can afford to pay and live in. An investor market prices homes by what the asset will yield and what capital will bear. In an investor market, the end user is not the primary customer. The end user is the tenant, and the tenant's rent is the product. This is where the language of the market becomes important. You will hear that institutional investment in housing provides liquidity, creates professionalized management, maintains properties that small landlords neglect, gives renters better service. Some of that is occasionally true at the individual property level. None of it addresses the structural question, which is this: when housing transitions from an asset class accessible to working households into a yield product managed by institutional capital, who captures the appreciation? The answer is not the tenant. The tenant captures a place to live, at a price they did not set, on a lease they cannot negotiate, in a home they will never own. The appreciation goes to the portfolio, and the portfolio is not the tenant. That is the transaction at the center of this story. Not a conspiracy, not a scandal, just a market that was allowed to optimize for return and did exactly that, and in doing so priced out the people it was supposed to serve. The house was supposed to be the floor. Now the floor has a yield attached to it, and if you cannot pay the yield, the floor belongs to someone else. That is not the housing market failing. That is the housing market doing precisely what it was restructured to do.